Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our third JSI Puede webinar. Thus far, we've taken a look at juvenile and restorative justice with Veronica Vargas, and we've explored the effects of climate change on migration with Marcela Garcia. These meetings have been recorded and will be shared out, as will today's session. Today, I am very excited to introduce Héctor Sánchez Barba. Mr. Sanchez's accomplishments are many. He plays a central role in the national advocacy leadership. In 2012, he was elected chair of the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda, the NHLA, a coalition comprised of the 46 leading national Latino organizations. He was re-elected in 2015 and then named the first chair emeritus in 2018. In 2019, he joined the National Board of Directors of Planned Parenthood Federation of America, the first Latino in the history of the organization. He was also the executive director of the Labor Council for Latin American Development. Currently, he is the CEO and executive director of Mi Familia, Vota. Now, I could go on and on with his accomplishments and resume, but I'll stop there and let you hear from Mr. Sanchez himself. Without further ado, Mr. Héctor Sánchez Barba.
Thank you, Angel. Thank you, Rodolfo, and thank you, everybody, for the invitation. Rodolfo informed me that this is a conversation about the Latino vote. So I'm going to give a quick perspective of some of the Latino vote, but mostly focus on the analysis, the historical analysis of where we are as a community and some of the opportunities that we see as an organization and that I see as a leader in the community in terms of opportunities moving forward. Let me tell you a little bit about Mi Familia Vota. Mi Familia Vota is a national Latino organization. We have presence, offices, spaces, community centers in 7 states. Those states are Florida, Georgia, Texas, Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, and California. And we also have some sort of presence in other states depending of the political moment and the electoral moment. But we're a national organization, so engaged in a number of coalitions, in a number of campaigns, work, etc. We have the largest field operation in the Latino community. That means that we are the organization that is on the ground. We are the organization that is in the community centers, in the mercados, in the tortillerias, at the doors with our community, talking about civic participation and anything related to democracy. We do citizenship, we do voter registration, we do GOTV, we do voter education, and then we do voter mobilization. And we engage from a very holistic approach. The way we organize is called, and I inherit this, I didn't name it, it's called the organizing structure of the ocho patas. In Spanish is the 8 pillars of organizing. So basically everything that we do, we collaborate with these 8 pillars that are the base of the community. And those are the churches, schools, labor, community-based organizations, consulates, TV networks in Spanish, immigrant groups, etc. It's a very holistic approach. And that's why historically, Mi Familia Vota has been very successful and we have the trust of the community. The last year was very interesting for a number of reasons. We were facing, and we are a 501c3, which is a non-partisan, and a 501c4 that has more political elements. So I'm going to contextualize some of the analysis on how the last election took place. So from that perspective, the last year was very interesting, especially because we are a field operation. So the soul of our organization is to be on the streets, helping our communities and advancing our policy priorities. In terms of policy priorities, we tied all of the infrastructure that we have and all of the conversations that we have and all the organizing elements that we have to those policy priorities to hold all politicians accountable. And those priorities are health, education, immigration, the economy, women's rights, and voting rights. So we're always working around these issues. So we are at the doors, but at the same time, we are mobilizing our community and we're putting pressure on all the politicians to make sure that we're moving in a positive direction on these issues. Last year, obviously, was unique for the nation, but it was particularly difficult for the Latino and the immigrant community because of COVID. There are two elements from that perspective. In the first hand, at the very beginning and through now, the Latino and the immigrant communities have been in the front line, really sustaining and maintaining our economy. Latinos and Latinas and immigrants, many of us are so lucky to be here sitting in our houses and continue working from this perspective. But for a big percentage of the community, this didn't change at all. They had to stay well represented in construction, well represented in farm workers. Farm workers are majority immigrants and Latinos. They were the ones feeding us while the pandemic was in place. In terms of services, the Latino community is overrepresented in restaurants, hotels, etc. So I don't want to get into all the numbers, but we know where the community, the Latino community, is represented. So for the Latino community, mostly a working class community, we remain in the front lines, literally keeping the nation going, keeping the economy going, keeping all these different elements. But we were the community that were exposed the most to the serious dangers of COVID. So that's why Latinos, Latinas, and immigrants had the largest percentage of COVID, hospitalization, death rates, etc. So it has been a devastating issue for the community. And obviously, it was extremely politicized by the last administration. And I'm going to talk about the last administration in a second. So for us who have the organization with the largest field operation in the nation, it was a very unique and difficult moment because being in the field is what defines us. Talking to people, organizing in the communities, helping communities is what defines the organization. So I made the immediate decision to stop the operations all over the nation. We have 16 offices in all over the nation, and the operations, the ground operations, are always working and in place. So immediately, I hold everything and I asked everybody to start working from home. And we invested heavily in, we also have digital operations, the phones, the texting, etc. Everything that covers the political campaigns. In a traditional way, we also have all of those operations. So we invested heavily to respond to the needs of the community from that perspective while we kept the operations at home. So immediately we added COVID to everything in our campaigns. So even though we are a political organization, a civic engagement organization, a democracy organization, the needs of the community were huge and we had the infrastructure to respond to the needs. So we turned everything into a COVID, I don't know how to call it, but just a space for education and guidance for our people because we're trusted, they know us, and we had all these operations, especially in the most important election in the history of our community and probably the nation. So we had all these big plans. So we turned the whole operation into assisting on COVID. Even though we are not experts on COVID, we had the trust of the organization. So we immediately partnered with organizations that are experts on issues related to COVID, with doctors, nurses, etc., clinics, and we turn the operation into first, a top priority, inform and educate and guide people on anything related to COVID. Where can they go? What does it mean? What are the centers that they can contact? What are the 1-800? By the way, we turn our 1-800, that is the only full-time 1-800 in the community for issues, because we have the capacity to staff it all the time. A lot of the 1-800s are based on voluntaries. It's amazing efforts. But it's very different when you have a paid operation because you can constantly be there. So we turned this operation into a COVID information space. Again, we are not the experts, but we were guiding people to the sources of the most trusted information. And that was so critical, especially at a time when our community was facing the largest attacks with misinformation in the nation, in the history of humanity, literally. I know we all are in different states, but depending on the states and the politics of the states, the misinformation was very dangerous because they connected COVID, they politicized COVID, they were pushing information out on COVID that were lies, they were scaring people, and they attached this to the election And obviously, it had an impact on the elections in states like Florida, Texas, and other states. So misinformation is a top priority from democracy point of view for us, but at the same time, in the impact it had in the community. So we continue the operations while at the same time we build, and this was a structural decision to build the most aggressive campaign in the history of the Latino community against a single person. And that person was Donald Trump. We built a campaign called Basta Trump, and we structurally, and it was so beautiful how we came to this campaign. Obviously, I was working it with the board. But right before COVID, a couple of weeks before COVID, I'm here in Washington, D.C., and our offices are at the EFL. We were at the 8th floor, and it's probably the most amazing room in the city because you have a views to Lafayette Park, and the White House and the Washington Memorial is a powerful view. So sitting in that room with the leaders, the state directors, the national staff, etc., for all the operations, it was shocking to me that all of us, with the exception of two, we all were immigrants. We all are immigrants. And the two that were not immigrants were the children of undocumented immigrants. So it was very powerful, that image, to be there and see literally across the street, the house, that is a powerful image, but at the same time that represented at that moment, the biggest enemy of our democracy and the biggest enemy of our community at the time. So we decided in that moment that everything that we were gonna do last year, every single action, every single move, every single anything that we move in the organization was with an intention to get Trump out of office. So we built the largest operation, and the campaign was called Basta Trump. And we connected all that from the C4 perspective to making sure that we responded to all the attacks on the Latino community, misinformation, but more importantly, that we educated the Latino community on the danger that it meant to have Trump in office. So it was the most successful campaign. I don't want to bore you with numbers. All of this you can find in our websites, in Mi Familia Vota, in Facebook, in all the social media stuff. But it was the most successful campaign in the Latino community. But it was also very interesting for me that when I told everybody that they needed to stay home, and it was non-negotiable, you can never tell an organizer to stay home when your families are dying. And suddenly, I start seeing elements in social media that my state directors, my organizers are on the communities because they want to help people. They're helping people. They're educating people. They're providing information, etc., which is it's something to admire. So I convene a call with all the state directors and all the national staff, and I say, okay, I see that everybody's out. That was not the direction that I wanted to do to the organization, but I understand why all of you are doing this, and it's obviously exemplary. So if we're going to do this, we need to do it structurally and in the best possible way, and I'm going to invest heavily to make sure that the best protections are put in place, the best education COVID-related, the best engagement with the community, etc. So we invested heavily. Before we invested, we took a vote because obviously with all the dangers of COVID, I wanted to make sure that we all took this decision together. So we took a vote, and it was an unanimous vote. There was not even discussion, that everybody wanted to be out in the front lines, in person, helping our community. Not only in terms of COVID, but it was a big risk because while the Democratic Party, and by the way, we're non-partisan, while the Democratic Party didn't have a single person at the doors, the Trump campaign had 1 million people at the doors, knocking on doors and promoting the campaign. So it was a risk from the COVID perspective that our community needed education and trusted voices, but it was at the same time a very risky political time because we know that being at the doors, being in the community is the best way to organize our people, and nobody was out there. So we were the first organization to come out. I come from a labor background, so I invested heavily implementing all the procedures and the protections from the labor approach. We also adopted all the protections that the consultants were using. And then we also adopted the tables, the protections that the tables in the states, the political tables, were recommending. So we had almost 2,000 people in the field, and I'm happy to report that not a single person was infected with COVID, because all the organizational elements and the distance and the regulations and the roles and how everybody engaged with people at the doors and in the communities were very, very strict and very strong. So from that point of view, it was a very unique way to respond to the needs and how an infrastructure had to reinvent itself to help the community in the top priority of the nation and in the top priority of the community that was COVID. And at the same time, implementing a campaign to make sure that Latinos came out in historical numbers, and that we were fighting misinformation. Happy to report that we had the largest turnout of Latinos in the history of the Latino community and our democracy, regardless of COVID. Almost 17 million people came out to vote. It was an increase of 30% of a number of people that came out on red from the election 4 years ago. So it was a drastic increase. The average increase in the nation was almost 15% for everybody. So Latinos came out twice that number in more capacity, etc. So when I hear people saying Latinos don't come out to vote, or Latinos don't engage in democracy, or Latinos are apathetic, that's BS, because we know that when we invest, when we do the work, and when we provide all the possibilities and the basic elements of democracy, our community comes out to vote and engage in historical numbers. And immigrants are at even higher level. Immigrants believe in democracy, even as immigrants want to contribute, immigrants want to engage in the democratic process. So it was just a beautiful example of democracy, of how Latinos came out to vote. And in 1 second, I'm going to check the questions over here, but let me just finish a little bit of the presentation that I want to finish. So after that, obviously we engage after the very successful campaign. And by the way, the majority of voters voting heavily in one particular direction. There is no doubt, and all the research shows that it was thanks to the Latino community that Biden got to the White House. Obviously, other elements of the democracy, but it was very heavily in one direction. 66% of Latinos voted for Biden. Let me tell you and answer the question that probably many of you have. Every single reporter that I talked to, the first question during election and after election is, why Latinos voting in historical numbers for Trump? That was the history that drove the story that drove the national election. And it's a sad approach, because it's very clear how Latinos voted, how Latinos literally were in the front lines defending and protecting our democracy at a time when we have the biggest misogynist, narcissist, extremist voice in the White House that was terrorizing our nation with all of his policies, was terrorizing literally every community in the nation with the women's agenda, the LGBTQ agenda, the immigrant agenda, etc. And the impact was felt. It's an impact that we all as a nation are gonna feel in decades to come. So yet, guess the biggest story related to democracy was the Latino vote, when the biggest story should have been the white vote in the nation. And how do we explain that having 4 years of this monster in the White House, the majority of white men and white women voted for Trump? That should have been the main story in the nation, because that's a very dangerous situation that our democracy is facing. Yet the minorities were the ones in the front line saving our democracy, because minorities were the ones that put Biden in the White House. If we look at the Black vote, if we look at the Latino vote, if we look at the Asian vote, if we look at the minority women vote, because white women also voted in a majority for Trump. That is the biggest danger that we saw during the last election. Yet it wasn't the national story. Every story was like, why Latinos are voting for Trump in Miami? Well, that's a national pattern, because Cubans historically have voted Republican. Or why this little town in the border voted for Trump? Instead of looking at all the analysis and what happened in the field. The second element that is important to understand when it comes to democracy is the structural exclusion of the Latino and the immigrant community historically from democracy. Obviously, we are, I'm very fortunate that I was trained by an African-American lady. So I have the honor to understand and recognize the historical struggle and fight and contributions of the African-American community for democracy, literally people that die for our democracy. People, one of my biggest honors has been to march in the Selma to Montgomery March, shoulder to shoulder with people that have been in the front lines protecting our democracy. So that's one beautiful and powerful element of democracy from the African-American community. But from the Latino community, there has been an historical exclusion from all the different, also from all the different elements of democracy. But in the context of recent context, there is no investment on Latino democracy. When I was chair of NHLA, we did an analysis of the amount of money. By the way, democracy is very expensive. There is a direct correlation of the money that you invest in communities and the number of people that come out to vote. And I don't remember the last number, but the majority of the money by far, more than 90% of all the money related to democracy, literally all of it goes to white communities. So when we look at minorities in the nation and the lack of investment, and when people say, well, these people are apathetic and they don't want to participate in our democracy, that's totally false. We know as an organization, and we have data and research that shows that when we do the work, all communities come out in historical numbers. In the Latino community, we know that as a fact in the African-American community, one of the communities that has been in the front lines fighting for democracy historically, and that has some of the highest turnout rates when it comes to democracy. All communities, minorities, understands the importance of the vote, yet we have to still fight voter suppression like in Texas right now. That is another way to literally exclude us from the democratic process. So from the money perspective, even in this last election, foundations that work on democracy are not investing in the Latino community. Less than 1% of the money goes to Latino efforts or the Latino community. The political parties, both Republicans and Democrats, take the Latino vote for granted. There is no real investment. The only investment that we see from parties is very transactional. Swing state last minute, the money comes in. We already know that as an organization, but it's a very transactional money just to win a last minute election. But the concept here and the point here is that unless we change that and we put the pressure that is necessary and the accountability that is necessary, we depend on organizations like mine and others that have limited budgets to do all the work related to democracy. So the point is, Latinos vote, Latinos come out in historical numbers, Latinos believe in democracy, Latinos run for office, and Latinos care about this democracy. And my big statement will be, minorities save our democracy in this last election. That will be the main headline. If somebody asks me, what will be the headline of the 2020 election? I will say, minorities save our democracy, because it's shown in all the numbers, it's shown in all the different spaces that we saw. And as we move forward, so that was 2020, as we move forward, the beautiful thing about this organization is that we have a year-round operations. We're always doing the basic, the hard work, which is talk to people, spend time at the door, convince them to register to vote, being at the schools, being at the churches, being in all these spaces that I mentioned, to make sure that once we help them, if they are immigrants, to become citizens, they trust us. We help them become registered to vote. We do the voter education, we do the mobilization, and then we make sure that they go to the polls. And when I say we make sure that they go to the polls, literally, we take them to the polls. Either we give them rides to the polls, we throw fiestas at the polls, we do concerts, we do anything that we have to do to make sure that our communities go to the polls, because everybody talks about how perfect our democracy is. When I go on international trips and people tell me what they think our democracy is totally different to the reality. This is one of the most difficult democracies to participate in, particularly for minorities. And how do we explain, for example, a couple of elections I was in Orlando, in a heavily Latino Puerto Rican community. It was 96 degrees. There was no water, there was no shade, and the line was 6 hours and a half waiting to vote. 15 minutes away from there, there was a suburban white community. And I tell you this because we were driving all over the area and making sure that we were analyzing what was happening at the polls. 15 minutes, literally 15 minutes drive from this location. It was a white suburban community and the line was 10 minutes. Why? These are the kind of questions that we need to ask to our democracy. Why democracy historically has worked for some, literally in a very easy way. And for some others, you have to wait 6 hours in line. You have poll tax historically. You had to die for the right to vote. So these are the questions that we are still facing as a nation. And this fight is more important than ever. What just happened in Texas is a reminder that there is a very important group of people in the nation that embrace the origins, the horrible origins of this nation, that say that only white men with property will have the right to vote. What happened in Texas is not a mistake and is not coincidence. What happens in Texas is a continuation of racist historical policies that want to exclude a particular groups of people from the right to vote. And that is unacceptable. And that is why Mi Familia Vota played the central role, taking those legislators from Texas out of the state. And we created, literally last minute, a conference to make sure that it was the element that kept them outside. And it was an amazing moment to see 50 people, more than 50 legislators, standing in unity. Some of them canceling important things. One of them had to cancel the wedding. The other one had literally canceling his own wedding. The other person had like anniversaries, birthdays. So it's very personal elements of this is not an abstract thing. It's people leaving the country, leaving the state to protect democracy in any way that they can. So it was an amazing opportunity for organizing and inspiring that we continue fighting these elements. But at the same time, we keep the expectations and the accountability on the other side too, with the Democrats at the very high level. The extremists in the Republican parties are using any excuse and playing dirty, having horrible impact in policies. And we're expecting the Democrats to be fighting for our democracy in a more aggressive way. And those campaigns we also do. We keep the Biden administration accountable. We keep governors accountable. We keep legislators accountable on the Hill, etc. But let me stop right there because that gives you a general view of the kind of work that we do. And maybe the last 15 minutes we can have a conversation.
I think I can speak for everyone in this room when I say that was extremely powerful. And thank you so much for everything you just said. I feel like I've learned so much, and I'm sure everyone else feels this way as well. That was an incredibly powerful presentation. So first, thank you for that. I would like to encourage anyone that is here to use the chat to ask any questions. We do have one from Rodolfo Vega. And his question is, after your experience with COVID, are you anticipating addressing health issues affecting Latinx people?
Health is a policy priority for us, but we haven't until this year engaged in direct services. There was something very interesting in a couple of our states. When it came to vaccination, there was no trust with the city because of whatever reason. Sometimes, for example, the African-American community, horrible experience with policing sometimes creates distrust. In the Latino community, or horrible experience with immigration enforcement, it creates elements of distrust, and etc. I can keep going. I'm just giving one example of some current issues that we're dealing with. So we decided to do clinics, spaces where we offer the vaccines. Yeah, we can call it clinics, but under Mi Familia Vota brand. So we had tents, we had everything. It was in partnership with the city. But the interesting part is that the city had a clinic and a space across the street from us. And there were like 10 people through the day. And I'm literally saying 10 people. And our line was across the street, etc. And we have the numbers, but it was just an example of what happens when you engage with the right partners. And we did this in a number of states. Even though, again, we are civic participation entity, we also use this opportunity to engage them in civic participation, but the top priority was to use our name and our brand to help people in the community with the biggest needs. So that's an important question, Rodolfo. We need to, as an organization, think about what will be the next steps when health issues or issues like COVID that are so serious and critical. How do we open the doors for our community to come to us that we're trusted? We're testing some new ways of organizing. We have offices all over the nation, and our offices are a little bit like community centers. We have chairs, we have spaces. Sometimes they ask us for the space to do a Mexican Independence Day or a Puerto Rican parade or whatever things, and we open our spaces. But we are really thinking about our models of organizing to buy or invest in bigger buildings where we invite other partners to provide their services there. For example, something that the right-wingers, extremist right-wingers have done is provide services like, we help you with your taxes, we help you with some health issues, we help you with investment advice, etc., and or with your driver's license, etc. You trust them, and then they use the religious angle to start getting into some policy issues that are very sensitive for a community, like abortion and other issues. And next thing you know, they have our community in their hands, giving them advice on everything related to policy, and then they vote for candidates that don't represent the most important elements of our community. So we are testing some of these elements in different spaces, and I will totally see, Rodolfo, offering something related to health and connect that to civic participation. That will be a space of trust for the communities that we're working.
Hector, we invited you because my colleagues and the company itself is seeking to look at the intersections of health in other areas. I wasn't thinking for you guys to provide to be a service provider. What I was thinking was mostly for you guys to be perhaps through partnerships, like you were saying, to have the, to mobilize the social capital that you have across the United States to do so.
Yeah, and again, right now it's just the partnership within the experts on vaccinations. We just provide the space and the branding, etc., and it has worked. It has been a major success. So down the road, we can see how these Mi Familia Vota community centers could have some health element with partners, not us, that are located in our spaces and that are providing some of the most important needs health related for our community. I know there are some concepts of clinics, etc., but I don't know. That will require some conversations with experts in the issues to see how this could look in the future.
We know. So thank you so very much, Hector. What we wanted to have this very short, brief meeting just to infuse these topics and themes in our company. We really, really appreciate your presence. Angel?
Muchas gracias. Hector, I know you have a hard stop at 1:45. I was curious if I could ask you one quick question. It's regarding, you mentioned that there was a record amount of Latino voters that turned out this past election, and as you so aptly put it, it was in a lot of ways a fight for democracy. I was wondering, how do you plan on sustaining that momentum that you've built in this past election, and ensuring that the vote turnout remains the same, or hopefully, and yeah, we prefer this, improves in the next election?
No, that's a good question, Angel, because that's the biggest challenge that we have. Usually midterm elections for everybody, the turnout is way lower. But we're taking that momentum of COVID engagement in the community to organize around issues. And our community cares exactly the same issues as the rest of other communities care. Healthcare, COVID response has been a top priority, and the economy. So one of the elements that we have to give credit to the Trump campaign, and it's so hard to say that, give credit to Trump, it was how they manipulated the messaging on the economy. Because some Latino men fell for that messaging that was aligned with misinformation and scaring people with the message in Florida of communism and they're going to take everything away, or certain messaging that was very damaging, but it scared people away. So for us, it's very important to make sure that the information and the education is 365 all year round, in all the elements of democracy. Right now, top priority is, other than COVID, is redistricting. Redistricting is a topic that is so important, yet so few people know about it and the impact that it has, and all the different elements of how this is a continuation of everything related to democracy. So right now, our top priority is the element of redistricting. And our plans for the next year is mobilizing. There are a number of very important Senate races and congressional races, etc., that we're already educating and mobilizing the community, just to make sure that we keep the pressure from the policy perspective on the ground, but also on all these politicians. It's a unique moment to hold politicians accountable. For example, Arizona is one of the most powerful examples. We have our largest field operation in Arizona. And in Arizona, the Latino vote literally defined the state for Biden. It's the first time since Clinton, literally, that a Democrat wins the state. And the Latino vote is very important over there. It's almost close to 30% of the vote, and they voted clearly for Biden. So this was a historical change. And this comes because Mi Familia, Vota, and other organizations, we created tables. We started organizing right after SB 1070. That was the most important anti-immigrant piece of legislation at the time. Start organizing, getting minorities elected to local Congress, getting minorities elected to Congress, etc. Fighting and targeting extremists like the Sheriff Joe Arpaio, that was one of the most extremist voices in the nation, etc. So all this organizing takes time, and we cannot just depend and respond to a last-minute engagement on swing states and elections. We have to do it all the time, and that's what we do as an organization.
Okay. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for coming in and presenting for us. That was incredible. I feel like I've learned so much. I feel motivated to go out and help. So if you ever need if you ever have any volunteering opportunities, please feel free to send them over to Rudy.
We always have spaces, Angel, actually, in all the states that I mentioned, and some national efforts. But the only favor that I ask, follow us. So you can see all the stuff that we do on Facebook, all the social, Facebook, Insta, Twitter, at Mi Familia Vota. And I use my accounts for work. So everything that I post is also related to this issue at Héctor Sánchez Barba. And we always continue sharing some of this interesting stuff and information.
Thank you so very much. And thank you all for joining us today. This was an incredible presentation. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. And we look forward to seeing you for our next presentation. Andrea, do you want to talk briefly about it?
Yes, I'll just say that this session is being recorded. I know that there is folks are taking some time off, so this will be dispersed to the whole company. We do have a couple of other sessions coming up. We're talking about a needs assessment, and I'll send a reminder out for folks next week. We're looking forward to it, and I appreciate you all being here, and thank you so much, Hector.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Have an amazing Friday.
You too. Take care.
Thank you.